It's finally time to check out the top 5 heavy tanks for tiers 9 and tiers 10 as part of the ongoing series that we're doing the top 5 vehicles for every single tech tree kind of tanks, looking at all of the tiers from tier 5 all the way to 10. We've done 2 parts so far, so if you haven't watched those, I highly recommend you go back and watch tiers 5 and 6, and then of course 7 and 8 in part 2, and then of course this is the top tier tanks, or at least the higher tier vehicles in the game. So I guess one of the most important things when deciding whether you want to grind up some certain tech trees, because ultimately you want the end tier tanks since you're going to be playing them the most. And so yeah, let's get into it. So without further ado, we'll start with tier 9, and the first one on the list, in no particular order, I'm not going to be rating them as this is the best tier 9 heavy tank, just these are the ones that I found to be the best ones. So the first one is of course the E75. Now this tier 9 heavy tank is so good. It has absolutely everything that you could possibly need from a heavy tank at this tier, because not only does this tank have pretty reasonable armor. The key thing about this tank is you can side scrape, you can use your armor pretty well, it's very flat, and so it lends itself to being able to pull out around corners, side scraping, and whatever you want to do with it, as well as being able to bounce a few rounds when moving side to side and stuff like that. You know, it's got fairly okay armor. Now, I'm not going to be saying, you know, you're going to be able to bounce Jaeger heat rounds, because they'll just go straight through the upper plate, as with pretty much any heavy tank in the game. But this tank is super fun to play, and that's why I've really enjoyed playing it, why I ended up 3 marking it, and it was in fact one of my first 3 marked vehicles, and actually had its own video on the channel about 6 years ago, maybe even longer. I don't know whether it's still up on the channel, but essentially I think I managed to get like a 9k damage game and we ran out of rounds or something like that. But yeah, it was a really great result in the E75. This tank, what's so special about it? Well, not only does it have the armor, like we've mentioned, it also has the main armament. So 490 alpha damage is very nice at tier 9, because it's in that sweet spot between you're not having to reload for like an infinite amount of time where you're going to get farmed by medium tanks. You're also not such a small reload that you end up sacrificing the alpha damage, and that's where I think it's in a very nice place, because you can consistently kick out damage, which means if someone YOLOs you, it's probably not going to end up all too well for them, but also that, you know, you're dealing a consistent amount of decent damage every single time you hit someone. So that's where I like using this tank, and that's why I find it to be very powerful in the game. Now, it also gets, because Wargaming thought it was good to give a tank that's already very good, they gave it 8 degrees of gun depression, which means that the E75 is actually very flexible for a heavy tank, especially considering what type of heavy tank it is, one that has fairly effective armor and a very good gun. It is very much like the German accuracy, 0.36 with the perks on. I don't know if we've got a commander in it. No, we haven't even got a commander. So if we put in a commander, for example, we'll just grab one from the Tiger 131. I don't know what the perks exactly were, but 0.31 accuracy. So you are very accurate in the E75, and that's what makes it really fun to play. And I highly recommend anyone that plays World of Tanks to grind their way towards the E75, because like we said in the part 2 of the video, the Tiger 2 is fantastic, the Tiger 1 is fantastic, and this is just the next level of kind of fun within the tier 9 heavy tanks, and that's really where I think everyone is not going to kind of argue with me about the E75 being very good. But what about some other tanks at tier 9? Because we have a ton of heavy tanks at tier 9, and we even have some premium heavy tanks. And you can see here the Concept 1B, which is the second vehicle of this video. And the Concept 1B is a tank that when I first played it, I thought, you know what, it's good, but is it exceptional? And I'm not going to stand here and say that the Concept 1B is exceptional, because it isn't exceptional. But what it is very solid. It brings something else to the table that you might not see with a lot of vehicles. And it is good. It is more than good. It's probably better, way better than average as a tier 9 heavy. And that is because much like the E75, it has a really nice kind of damage per minute when you fully kit out the tank. I don't know if we've got it fully kitted out, but we don't have a commander in it. So if we whack one in just to see the level at which this tank can play in, well, if we grab it, have a look at the armor viewer, you can see we've got a quite decent amount of armor in here. So the turret is very, very strong. It's hard to pen. A lot of people will not be able to pen it. There is this kind of sloped frontal kind of cone, I guess, or pyramid on the front of the hull armor, but that is actually really, really hard to pen because you can see the angle of it is very, very shallow, which means anything hitting it is just going to ricochet. And that's where the Concept 1B comes in really nicely. Pair that with the fact it gets 10 degrees of gun depression, 400 alpha, 0.31 accuracy, 2.1 second aim time, and yeah, is a very, very solid performer with 45 kilometers an hour, so it's a fairly speedy tier 9 heavy. Yeah, it's so flexible, and that's really what makes this tank be very, very good. And much like, or not like the rest of the other tier 9s, the turret armor of this thing is pretty much impenetrable for the most part. There is a cupola on the top which can be hit, and of course those cheeky bits just beneath the left and right hand side of the turret. The kind of bulbous bits either side of the main gun, that is a potential weak point where people can pen, so you've got to be careful a little bit, but it's predominantly like basically really high penetration guns can hit that and pen, and of course if anyone's above you they're going to easily pen this tank, but there we go. The Concept 1B, very, very solid performer. Now, we can have a ton of different tier 9 heavies within the game, but I guess the ones that I found to be the best are the all-rounders, and there are some good ones in terms of having like a ton of armor, but the problem with having armor, much like the Maushan, this is not a tank in here, just to let you know, the Maushan's terrible because it relies on its armor but doesn't have any, because of that big cupola and stuff like that and the lower plate. But this video is all about tanks that are competitive, so if you are only after competitive tanks, this is probably what you'd be looking to have a look at. But if you're after, having tanks that are like solid performers, but maybe a bit more novel and unique, then maybe you could have a look at a different video on that topic. But what you'll see here is the T10, and this is a very, very all-round vehicle. Now, I'm not saying it's the best out of the lot, but it definitely has its place as the tier 9 heavy that is very, very useful to have in game. It was better back in the day when this was originally in the game, but for me personally, I really enjoyed the playstyle of having like a heavy medium that has the 440 alpha damage, but has the reload to kind of back it up. This tank without a commander in has 2,700 damage per minute. And if, for example, we whack in a commander, of course I do have full commanders, so that helps out massively with statistics on vehicles, but 3,200 damage per minute, a 8.3 second reload to do 440 damage. And you might think, oh, the accuracy is going to be terrible. No, this accuracy is 0.31, so it's really, really accurate. It also can go up to 50 kilometers an hour, and I just think that the T10 is very, very underrated in today's meta. It's certainly not overpowered, but it is definitely forgotten about when people are talking about tier 9 heavies, and I definitely think it shouldn't be. The armor model is very much premium, will just basically get rid of the armor of this tank, but overall, yeah, a very solid heavy tank that I really enjoy playing. And of course that's down to my own playstyle of preferring medium / heavy medium tanks that have the armor that can bounce every now and again, but have the other aspects of World of Tanks like the camouflage, the vision, stuff like that, to really make it work even better. So that's kind of where I'm at with the T10. Now then, moving onwards and upwards, I guess the next tank is definitely a strange one for me, and that is the Object 752. Now, this tank, when I initially reviewed it, I genuinely thought it was like a medium tank, but having played it and having gone through it, I actually realised that the armour model of the tank is fantastic, at least for the most part. Like, it genuinely is kind of difficult to pen unless you've just got ridiculous amounts of pen. And that's because the frontal turret armour is 330mm, and of course it has a little bit of an angle to it, but most of the time it is fairly flat. So people with like very, very high penetration rounds will be able to pen you through the turret if they're looking at you flat on, which is why you want to be moving your turret left and right, making it difficult for people to be able to get the flat area of your turret when they actually fire. But the other thing is the lower plate is a potential weak point, but it is so small that it's very difficult to hit. Side armor, that is really where you want to get, and that in between the tracks and the actual side armor, but even then it's very well angled, making it super difficult if someone's side scraping to be able to get a good angle on this tank, because you kind of have a double angle where someone is going to try and hit that inside lower plate. Like, it's not even really a lower plate, it's like lower side armor, but when they do that, they're going to have multiple angles compiling that make it super hard to pen. But yeah, ultimately it's mainly the cupolas that let this tank down, since they are quite bulky and stuff, but it has very good armor is what I'm trying to tell you, and very trolly and bouncy armor, especially when people on console just don't aim 90% of the time. So that's really where the 752 comes in terms of its armor. However, this vehicle relies upon its autoloader, and that is because it's got a 3-shell autoloader that, you know, it's not that special in terms of having like a super high damage autoloader, but it has 390 damage per shell. So you're looking at 1170 alpha damage in one singular shell clip. So you can basically get 1170 damage, and that is very, very nice to be able to deal against a lot of the opponents, because remember, most of the opponents you come up against will not have the opportunity to deal that damage back to you. You've also got fairly okay accuracy, and you'll note that the damage per minute of this vehicle, when you've got all of the perks and equipment in it, is 2067. So that is very, very close to what the E75 would have, kind of within the same sort of limitations. This is slightly less accurate, as you'd expect with an autoloader, but remember, autoloaders typically have a better average, like effective damage per minute, because you can deal a lot of your damage in one small section, and then you can spend the time reloading, trying to find another opponent, so when you are reloaded you can deal your damage again. Whereas standard tanks will find a tank, maybe only get one shot into them, and then they only reload one shell in the period of time that it takes to get to the next opponent, and then they only deal one shell, and you know what I mean. Whereas if you had this tank, you could deal all 3 shells when you move, and then take the time that you would have spent just reloading one shell to reload 3, and that's kind of where being a good autoloading player comes in, and that's what this tank offers. So it has good armor, a great gun. It has trolley armor, so most people auto-aiming will just actually bounce off of you, and it's fairly fast, 40 kilometers an hour as well, decent hit points for a tier 9, although probably on the lower side. View range is okay, and remember, this hasn't got any perks in it, so if we were to put some perks on, I won't, because I'm saving up for more tier 10s at the moment. But yeah, essentially a very, very solid heavy tank, and I really enjoyed playing it, and I thought it was very, very powerful in most senses. But let's have a look at another tier 9 that I find very, very good as well. So the tank that I'm on about is of course the Object 257, and this is the tier 9 Soviet tank. It is kind of, if you think about the T10 as a tank, this is like the beefier version of the T10. Has better armor, you're more likely to bounce. It has this troll armor where you've got this diamond on the bottom of it, has this side armor that is like super well angled, like we saw with the 752 that we've just done, and it has decent turret armor as well. It has 440 alpha damage on the top gun. We don't actually currently own the tank in the game, we've only played through it, etc. But yeah, it was a very, very good tank to play through. Penetration side kind of lacking, but you get premium rounds of course, so it doesn't really matter that much. And damage per minute is kind of where this tank gets let down. It's very long reloads, but that is what you get for being able to go 50 kilometers an hour top speed. It is essentially an IS-7 down at tier 9 with, I would say, better armor potentially than the IS-7. And yeah, I just found this tank to be very, very fun to play. And of course, we'll have to buy it back at some point, maybe when the IS-7 goes on track and they reduce the price of the tier 9s down by 30%, and we'll go in through and buy a load of the vehicles as they come on sale. But either way, the Object 257, very, very powerful tank at tier 9 and really, really enjoyable as well. But let's look at one last tank that I'm sure you may have seen at the beginning of this video that I really enjoyed as well, which was the M103. And I found this tank to be very much a medium heavy tank playstyle. However, it does get the armor that you'd expect from a heavy tank in terms of the turret armor, except from the cupola, which just absolutely ruins this tank. And most people know about it, so you get penned all the time. Lower plate is kind of annoying as well. The big bulbous turret can be penned in the side, which is also annoying. Side armor is American, so basically terrible. And yeah, it's not the greatest start to me saying that this is actually a good tank and one of the best, but the key thing about this tank is the handling of the gun, the damage per minute that you have with this vehicle. And if we put in the USA commander here, you'll see that the damage per minute of the vehicle goes up to 3,244 damage per minute, which is perfect for a tier 9 heavy, and it is one of the top DPMs for a tier 9 heavy, and maybe even the best, I'm not entirely sure. But either way, the gun handling is almost godlike. 0.28 accuracy, that's the best so far in this little section of tanks that we've looked at. The best damage per minute in these sections of tanks that we've looked at. It has brilliant aim time. It can maybe not go as fast as some of the other vehicles, so you've got 34 kilometers an hour, so it's not as fast. You've got 10 degrees of gun depression though, so really, really useful to use. And when you use the 10 degrees of gun depression, you hide that awful cupola, which means that your armor becomes very, very good. And so yeah, you can use the turret armor quite well. And on the lead up to this vehicle, if you've played things like the T32, which were really, really good as well, the T29, you'll know how to use the turret armor of this thing and come away with results that are really good. So yeah, just a tank that in general I found to be very, very powerful. And of course, you could even run the advanced optics to get a little bit extra view range, such that you can outspot opponents that you'll be coming up against, because the vision range on this tank is good as well. So the M103, a perfect one, and hence why I actually went and 3-marked it within the game. An honourable mention here is the VKB, that is probably not the nicest for most people, but it is definitely a competitive tier 9 heavy tank that I found to be very, very strong, and it really did surprise me as a tank. But it's probably not in the top 5 most competitive, just purely based on the speed of the tank, and maybe the flexibility that the VKB offers you is not particularly great. But yeah, and one that is probably for more traditional heavy tank drivers that want really good armor when used effectively, the armor that is. But yeah, the VKB is like the addition to this kind of top 5. Then we have tier 10 vehicles, and this is probably where it gets a little bit more interesting, because there's a ton of tier 10 vehicles, and I guess we'll have to start with some of the ones that I've enjoyed the most. Now, I'm not saying that these are the only best tier 10 heavy tanks in the game and that you should play absolutely none of the rest of them, because I think playing a lot of the diverse tanks that you have at tier 10 heavies, because there are loads of different types. There are loads of ones that are very good in their own right, and they will have unique kind of attributes towards them, so it's good to play them all, and some will suit your playstyle more than they'll suit mine, and therefore you'll be able to do better in them than I will. But yeah, the ones I found to be kind of generally the better tanks that people generally like using more are the ones that we're going to showcase in today. And starting off the list, we are of course going to look at the T95 FV4201 Chieftain, which is essentially a better version of the Chieftain Mark 6. Why is that? Well, It has basically all of the attributes of the Chieftain, except it gets an extra 40 damage. It gets 100 less hit points, which is negligible to be honest. But what it does get is essentially just a way better armor model than the Chieftain has. You can see here that the turret armor is really annoying. Like, yeah, you do have some weaker points of it, but the cupola is really hard to hit, whereas the Chieftain standard is a little bit easier to hit. It's a bit more prominent, you can hit the cupola much easier, and there's also like the kind of area where you see that there's a machine gun port that can be penned as well. It's quite hard to do, but it can be done. And also the hull armor of the Chieftain Mark 6 is kind of bad as well, whereas the T95 has the T95 hull, which is kind of a little bit, I don't know, more well angled and a little bit more bouncy when you're kind of moving side to side and stuff like that. But in general, it's just basically a slightly better version of the Chieftain, but you could use either one and they're very good indeed. But what is the other attributes of the vehicle? Well, it's of course got 440 alpha damage, but it has 0.33 accuracy, and I believe this is without a commander, so we'll whack a British commander in here for you guys just to showcase what the tank can do with some of the perks that you have, like the top end. So 0.28 accuracy, 3,400 damage per minute. You can go 46 kilometers an hour top speed, which is fantastic for a heavy tank, remember. You've got view range that is very good as well. I don't know if we've got any view range advantages other than the commander ones, but you could potentially run advanced optics to increase it just a little bit better. And yeah, just a brilliant tank in general that I find very powerful, and under the hands of the right person can be super dominating on ridge lines and just be an annoying tank to come up against for the most part. So yeah, the T95 FV4201 Chieftain, a very solid tank, but unfortunately is premium. But either way, you could use the Chieftain Mark 6, which is essentially a almost identical tank except from the armor model and of course the 440 alpha, but you do get a few bonuses for playing this tank, and of course you don't have to pay any money for this one, so yeah, it's probably the better one that you could get. Now, moving on, tier 10 heavies. Of course, it couldn't be a top 5 tier 10 heavies without having the IS-7 in here. And what makes the IS-7 so special? Well, it is the armor of the turret. It's basically impenetrable. Yes, there are some cupolas, but they're so hard to hit that it's basically not even ever worth going for. You'd be better off trying to find an angle for the hull armor. If the IS-7 is for some reason looking up in the sky, you can pan the mantlet, but it's so small that you basically no point in going for it, and it's so opportunistic to try and do that that it's probably not ever going to work in the most part. The hull armor can be penned pretty much by everyone if they do basically get the side, or if you're angling to one side, it can be very easy to pen since it has the pike nose. Side armor is kind of troll if people hit that like spaced armor zone that's on the side or the tracks, but if they hit in the middle they're going to pen you, but it relies upon the top speed of the vehicle, since you can see here we're running a speed build in this tank, 72 kilometers an hour max speed as a heavy tank, that also, if you were to take the spool liner, would have insane ramming damage as well as speed. But yeah, you really want an all-round build. I would 100% take advanced loader, gun stabilizer, and improved ventilation or advanced optics, or potentially you choose the speed boost equipment that gives you a little bit more horsepower so that you can maintain your speed, because the majority of the time you cannot actually get up to 72 kilometers an hour. It's mainly one of those, that is your top speed, but in order to get there you need like the extra horsepower to maintain that top speed. So yeah, it's kind of one of those things where it's kind of a lie. You can't go 72 kilometers an hour on the average game along flat terrain, etc. But you can certainly go 50 kilometers an hour or 60 kilometers an hour in this vehicle, which make it super dominant as a heavy tank and a frontline brawler as well, with that turret armor, which make it outstanding, as well as having 490 alpha damage and pretty reasonable accuracy with all of the perks and equipment that we've just highlighted. But yeah, a really fun one to play. And then as its kind of smaller brother and more medium tank playstyle, the Object 277, which is my personal favourite of all of the Soviet tier 10 heavy tanks, and definitely the tier 10 heavy kind of non-premium tech tree tanks. So the Object 277, what makes this tank perfect, for me anyway, it's the accuracy, the damage per minute, the consistency, the speed, the hit points, and just in general being very, very flexible, as well as having troll armor as well. A lot of people bounce off of this thing because when they auto aim, it is not on the lower plate, which some vehicles have. It's actually on the upper plate, which is very, very well angled and makes it super difficult for them to pen. Cupola is very, very small as well. Side armor is very good if you do angle and kind of move around and make it difficult for people to consistently aim at it. And yeah, I just love this tank in general. Good view range as well, and can be boosted up with perks and equipment and commander that I would maybe suggest using, but it's down to your own personal preference. It's a aggressive heavy tank as well, so you can get frontline and have the accuracy to also snipe when needed in the later and mid stages of each of the games. But yeah, the Object 277, one of my favourites, and why I've played it a decent amount, and yeah, it's certainly one of my go-to tier 10 heavies if I want to play the game and have some good results as well as enjoyable results at the same time. Now then, moving on, there is of course the auto loader question, and I guess we could bundle in the AMX-50B and the T-57 into this as one tank, or essentially very similar tanks. And these are the top four, so within the four vehicles, fourth slot that we're looking at. And the T-57 Heavy and 50B are a 4-shot autoloader that has 400 damage per shell, 1600 total damage that you can deal in one singular clip, and it also has decent accuracy, decent aim time, very good damage per minute, and effective damage per minute as well. Remember, like we talked about earlier, with being able to deal all of your shells in one small period, then take the time to reload to find another opponent or the same opponent, or put yourself in a better position, etc, etc. They also have decent view range typically in these tanks if you were to kind of boost them up. Probably not the best in the 57 Heavy, maybe the 50B is slightly better. Speed wise, 50B is faster, so maybe you'd rather play that tank. Armor wise, they don't really have any, so you can't really rely upon that at all. But yeah, you can bounce a few rounds, but unlikely. The hull armor is where the armor is predominantly at, but most people will fire at that turret because you've got basically just little bags on the side of the turret which are big and easy to pen, so that's where most people will hit you, and they're rounded, which makes it even better for people to be able to basically pen you from all angles, since you know about circles. Whichever angle you look at it, there will be a flat face for you to shoot at because it's circular, and of course as you move around that circle you end up being perpendicular to the face of the turret at all times. So having a circular turret is not necessarily the best thing. So yeah, that's really where the T-57 Heavy sucks in terms of its gameplay. But having 3-marked it and played it a enormous amount, really. I think I played like 700 games or something in this tank at this point. It is a very solid performer, and I just love playing it along with the 50B, which is why yeah, I enjoyed that tank immensely. But what else do we have? Well, we also have the T125, and you could probably see a trend coming in here, and typically the tanks I enjoy are the medium / heavy medium playstyles, where you've got good gun handling, much like the M103. The T125 is perfect as well in that playstyle, where you have decent damage dealing capacities, so good DPM, as well as having a little bit of armor, but in allowing you to basically come toe-to-toe with a lot of medium tanks and push aggressively and get into positions whilst maintaining a decent level of damage per minute. So you can see here the T125 with no commander in it, I believe, has 3,200 damage per minute, which if we were to put a commander in, you can see goes up to 3,800, which rivals medium tanks with 0.26 accuracy and of course a 6.26 second reload for 400 alpha with good armor armor in general for the most part, especially on the turret with 10 degrees of gun depression, so 8 degrees, sorry. Super flexible tank, and I love this thing immensely, which is why I must have gone out at some point and decided to 3-mark the thing. So yeah, really enjoyable tank, and of course the ending up the list. Now there are some honourable mentions. Of course the Super Conqueror is a very powerful tier 10 heavy tank, and definitely well within the realms of being in a top 5, but that's really where we grouped it in with the T95, and I just think the T95 has the edge over the Super Conch just because it's faster and just a little bit more flexible in my opinion. And of course you can look at things like the 279E, which is very powerful in its own right and has some armor, but I don't know that it's top 5. And then of course the Kranvang is essentially the T57 heavy, but with good armor in terms of its turret armor. So yeah, that's kind of where it's at, but worse gun handling, and so makes it harder to be more consistent. But yeah, that is genuinely what I would say to be the top 5 list. You do have things like the Quillin, which are just kind of the oddballs. Imagine the T10 but at tier 10 with a much better gun. That is what the Quillin is, and yeah, definitely worthy of being kind of like top 10, top 5 maybe as well, but it's down to personal preference. I just found the Quillin to be a little bit boring in my opinion, just because it is blatantly OP and very strong. But there you go, that is my top 5 list. Of course yours might be completely different. You might absolutely hate playing the medium heavy playstyle, and you might be going, the E100, that is where the tier 10 heavies are at. The Object 279E, that is where the top 5 is. And you might be going, you know what, actually maybe it's none of those and I really enjoy the Maus, or I really enjoy the IS-4, which is a good tank as well. But yeah, interested to see what you guys think, and of course hopefully it gives you a good indication as to what tanks are fairly decent at each of the tiers. Definitely never get the Object 780, that's all I'm saying. It's absolutely useless as a heavy tank, but there you go. That is my opinion on all of the heavy tanks between tiers 5 and tiers 10, at least in terms of the top 5 for each tier, and hopefully gave you a good indication of the sort of videos that we'll be coming out with for medium tanks and light tanks as the future comes on. I'm hoping to do these maybe once a week during the next few months, just making sure to cover the top 5 for mediums, heavies, light tanks and tank destroyers, and we won't look at artillery because basically all the American ones and the German ones, and some of the Soviets, but yeah, hopefully it was a good worth your time. I appreciate that all of the videos are very long. We'll probably combine all of these videos into one video and then publish it later on down the line as the full guide to heavy tanks between tiers 5 and 10, so you can catch out for that video at a later date. And of course don't forget to check back at the tier 5 and 6 vehicles, which are part 1, the tier 7 and 8 vehicles, which are part 2, and of course this one being part 3, which you already know. Other than that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day, and if you want to check out any more videos that give you top 5 guides, then I will leave the top 5 playlist on screen right now on the right hand side, and then the latest gameplay and tank reviews playlist updated with all of the tech tree reviews and tank reviews that we've done for World of Tanks so far. Thank you and goodbye.